The 45th floor of Halston Capitol Tower wasn't just a place of business. It was a kingdom ruled by one man's ego. Every morning, the receptionists stood a little straighter, the assistants typed a little faster, and the executives rehearsed every word they might say if they crossed paths with Charles Remington, billionaire founder and CEO. That morning, however, something different happened. When the private elevator dinged open at precisely 10 a.m., all heads turned. A tall, elegant black woman stepped out with quiet confidence. Her name was Ava Mitchell, age 34, Harvard graduate, former Goldman Sachs strategist, and now the senior partner at Wellington Investment Fund, a global firm managing over $4 billion in strategic capital. But to the employees at Halston, she was just another important visitor. She was ushered into the boardroom. Polished floors, glass walls, and oversized portraits of Charles himself lining the room. All the senior executives were seated, murmuring to one another. But the only man who didn't rise was Charles. He sat at the head of the table, one leg crossed over the other, sipping espresso like a king surveying his subjects. He didn't even look up until Ava stopped at the edge of the table and extended her hand. "Mr. Remington," she said with warmth and grace, "a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Charles looked at her hand, then at her. He didn't stand, he didn't smile. And then he said the words that sucked the air out of the room. "I don't shake hands with staff." The silence that followed was suffocating. One executive coughed. Another shuffled papers to avoid eye contact. Ava didn't flinch. She slowly withdrew her hand and smiled politely. "Of course," she said softly. She took her seat without another word, placing a sleek leather folder on the table. Everyone watched her with a mix of guilt and fear, as if bracing for an explosion. But Ava, calm, collected, completely composed. Charles smirked. "Let's get this over with, shall we?" For a man who had spent decades building financial empires, he had no idea that the biggest shift in his company's history had already begun. Right there, in that awkward silence. The Halston Capital boardroom had seen many power plays, but none quite like this. Ava Mitchell, calm as ever, adjusted her files and clicked the first slide of her presentation. A graph lit up the screen. Sharp growth trends, strategic opportunities, and calculated risks. Everything a high-level investor would want to see. But Charles Remington wasn't watching the screen. He was watching her. He leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that screamed. "I've already decided." Ava continued her pitch professionally. "Wellington is prepared to inject $400 million into Halston Capital as an equity partner, with additional syndicate support lined up for international expansion. The structure would give you growth without debt overload." Charles interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Slow down. That's a lot of numbers from someone I've never even heard of." There was a pause. Ava glanced briefly at the board, but no one came to her defense. She nodded and continued, unfazed. "I've spent the last decade structuring deals in markets where most funds won't even step foot," she said. "The Wellington Fund has led successful exits worth more than $1.2 billion in the last 18 months alone." Another executive, a younger man in a gray suit, tried to shift the energy. "We've reviewed the materials, and Ava's team brings an edge we've never had access to before. This partnership could fast-track our Southeast Asia division." Charles cut him off. "I'm not concerned with edge. I'm concerned with legacy. You know how many Ivy League types come in here with a fancy pitch deck and a polished voice?" He chuckled again and turned to Ava. "Let me guess. Harvard?" "Yes," Ava replied. "And Oxford." He raised an eyebrow. "Dual degrees? Huh, that's cute." The room tensed. Even the projector seemed to buzz louder. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't give him what he wanted: anger, defensiveness, or even sarcasm. She simply smiled and clicked to the next slide. Her voice remained calm. "Let me now walk you through how Wellington would structure the deal. You'll retain majority control, but Wellington would provide operational support in key markets. Our partners in Abu Dhabi and Singapore are prepared to—" Charles waved his hand again. "Look, let's just call this what it is. You're the face they sent. The fund probably makes the real decisions back in New York or London, right?" Ava paused. "I am the fund." Charles leaned forward. "You're telling me you're the final decision-maker on a $4 billion portfolio?" Ava met his gaze with ice-cold confidence. "I don't speak on behalf of power. I am power." The room fell silent. Charles smirked and leaned back again. "Still, this feels like a formality. I've got 4 other options on the table. You're not the only game in town." Ava nodded slowly, closed her folder, and placed the clicker on the table. She looked around the room, at the assistants, the analysts, the executives sitting in uneasy silence. Then she turned back to Charles. "You're absolutely right," she said. "You're not the only game in town, and neither are we. But the difference is, we came here willing to build something. You just wanted to flex." She stood up. "Let me save you some time." She clicked one final slide. It wasn't a graph. It was a letter, and at the top in bold black font were the words, "Notice of immediate withdrawal." For a full 5 seconds, no one in the room breathed. The slide on the screen was crystal clear. "Notice of immediate withdrawal." Signed, dated, and sealed with Wellington Fund's golden logo in the corner. There was no ambiguity, no bluff, no room to negotiate. Charles stared at it, his smirk evaporating like mist under sunlight. What is this?" Ava stood tall, her face calm but resolute. "This is formal notice that the Wellington Investment Fund is withdrawing all interest in Halston Capital, effective immediately." An audible gasp came from the right side of the boardroom. One of the assistants dropped her pen. A mid-level executive's jaw visibly dropped. Another, clearly nervous, muttered under his breath, "We were counting on this." Charles, now visibly rattled, leaned forward. "You're walking away? Over what? A handshake?" Ava didn't blink. It was never about the handshake. Charles stood now, gesturing wildly. "Then what is it about? What? I didn't compliment your pitch deck? I didn't bow when you walked in? Come on." She took a breath and spoke slowly. "It's about how you see people. The way you dismissed me without knowing who I was. The way you assumed I was a front. The way you mocked my degrees, my experience, my voice." He scoffed. "You think I don't have people lining up to throw money at me? You think I need you?" Ava stepped forward, not angrily, but with the quiet power of someone used to commanding empires from behind the scenes. "You're right. You don't need me. You need what I represent. You need vision. You need respect in global markets. You need the backing of serious capital. But more than that, you needed someone who believed in your future. I walked in here with all of it." She paused, letting the silence bite. "You lost it all before the meeting even started." The room was frozen. No one dared make eye contact with Charles, whose face had turned red with a mix of confusion, frustration, and bruised ego. He turned to the board, desperate. "You're just going to let her walk out of here with $400 million? A voice from the far end of the table, soft but clear, answered, "$400 million was just the beginning." All heads turned. It was James Collier, Halston CFO, quiet, observant. He had sat silently for the whole meeting, until now. Ava nodded slightly toward him. "James understands. Wellington wasn't offering just a capital deal. We were discussing a full three-branch merger. Halston Capital would have been introduced into Wellington's Asia, MENA, and South America pipelines. She turned back to Charles. Total projected deal value over 10 years? She tapped her finger gently on the table. $4.2 billion. The room erupted into murmurs. One executive whispered, "Oh my God." Another covered his mouth in shock. Charles was speechless. For the first time in years, the man who ruled every room he entered had lost control. Ava picked up her folder and adjusted her handbag. "We came here with respect," she said. "But you only see status. That's why you'll always be chasing power, while people like me build it." And with that, she walked toward the door. No one stopped her. No one could. The sound of Ava's heels tapping down the marble hallway echoed through Halston Capital like a warning bell. Not loud, but clear. In the boardroom, no one dared to speak first. It was as if her presence still lingered, even after she left. Charles Remington slumped back into his chair, the fire in his eyes now dim. For the first time in his life, he had no comeback. The king had been dethroned. Not by a hostile takeover, not by a lawsuit, but by a woman he hadn't even thought worthy of a handshake. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the voice of James Collier, the CFO. "You know," he said slowly, "this was our last real chance to hit our next quarter projections. The Singapore office has already burned through its seed capital. The Dubai merger failed. We needed Wellington to stabilize international operations." Charles slammed his fist on the table. "We'll find another investor. We're Halston Capital." But his words rang hollow. Another board member spoke up, a woman in her 50s, elegant and composed. "Do you really think another firm will invest now, after this? You embarrassed her, and she didn't just walk away. She pulled the entire Wellington pipeline with her." She leaned forward. That $4.2 billion was never just about money. It was about reputation, trust, access. Charles tried to brush it off. "She was bluffing. You all saw it. She staged that letter. It was theater." "No," James said firmly. "That was real, and she didn't come alone. Wellington was watching. They knew what they were doing. She was testing your leadership, and you failed." Charles clenched his jaw. He looked out the window, at the skyline he once believed he ruled. The buildings now seemed colder, taller, unreachable. Meanwhile, down in the lobby, Ava stepped into her black SUV. Her assistant, Priya, closed the door behind her. "That went about how we expected," Ava said, removing her heels and massaging the arch of her foot. "You want me to cancel the 3 p.m. with Braxton Holdings?" Ava shook her head. "No, move it up. I'll be ready in 20 minutes. Priya hesitated. "They'll ask about the Halston fallout. It'll hit the press." Ava smiled. "Let it. I want the world to see what happens when a dinosaur refuses to evolve." Priya nodded. As the car pulled away, Ava stared out the tinted window at the massive H logo outside Halston Capital's entrance. She remembered something her grandmother once told her. Some men build empires with gold and concrete, but real queens, they build with vision, and they never beg for a seat. They bring their own table. Ava never needed Charles Remington to validate her. She needed him to reveal himself, and he did, completely, proudly, dest. Back in the boardroom, phones buzzed. News was spreading. Breaking: Wellington Fund withdraws $4 billion deal from Halston Capital. One of the junior analysts checked his screen. It's already trending on LinkedIn, and Bloomberg just picked it up. Charles grabbed his phone. Missed call, board chairman. Text: "We need to talk, now." He looked around at his board. Half of them were already texting, possibly planning their exits or aligning with someone else. The once loyal room had fractured. Charles knew what was coming next: the fall. And it all started with 5 simple words: "I don't shake hands with staff." The fallout happened faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, headlines were everywhere. Wellington Fund abruptly ends $4 billion partnership with Halston Capital. CEO Charles Remington under fire for disrespect during investor meeting. Finance titan faces backlash after viral boardroom blunder. Every outlet had a different headline, but the story was the same. One moment of arrogance had cost a legacy firm everything. Inside Halston Capital's towering glass building, panic set in. Emails from foreign partners were pouring in. A major banking institution backed out of a joint project. Stock price dipped 7% in a single afternoon. Venture partners began pulling interest. And at the center of it all, Charles Remington sat in his office, silent. He stared at his phone, replaying the moment in his head. "Don't shake hands with staff." He muttered the words aloud, as if hearing them again would somehow soften their sting. But they didn't. They cut deeper each time. The boardroom where he once ruled like a king was now his courtroom, and the verdict wasn't going in his favor. Board members began holding secret discussions. Rumors of a vote to remove him as CEO spread through the halls like wildfire. Across the city, Ava Mitchell stood in a sleek glass conference room of Braxton Holdings. She had just wrapped a flawless presentation, this time with the full respect she deserved. One of the Braxton partners, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, looked over the figures and then at her. "We heard what happened at Halston," he said carefully. Ava didn't flinch. So did the world. He leaned back in his chair. "I must say, walking away from a $4 billion opportunity must have been hard." Ava smiled. "Not as hard as keeping my integrity in a room that did." The man nodded. "Well, we'd be honored to work with someone who walks away from the wrong deals just as confidently as she walks into the right ones." He extended his hand. Ava shook it, firmly. And that was it. A new deal was born. A better one. Backed with respect, vision, and equality. A week later, Charles walked into the boardroom, but this time, the atmosphere had changed. No warm greetings, no nods, no smiles, just silence. James Collier stood at the head of the table with a document in hand. "Charles," he began, "the board has made a decision." Charles sighed. "So that's it?" James didn't answer. He didn't need to. He slid the paper forward. Termination agreement. Charles stared at it. His empire had crumbled, not because of finances or fraud or scandal, but because he couldn't see past his own ego. He signed the document and stood defeated. No one stood with him. No applause, just quiet justice. Somewhere across the city, Ava stood on the rooftop of her firm's headquarters, sipping coffee, watching the skyline. Her assistant joined her. "The press wants your comment." Ava shook her head. "I already gave it." Priya frowned. "When?" Ava smiled, eyes still on the horizon. "When I walked away." She didn't need to scream. She didn't need revenge. She let her silence speak louder than any headline. Because true power doesn't demand respect, it commands it. And that's exactly what she had done. If you liked this story of class, power, and silent victory, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to know. Sometimes, walking away is the strongest move you can make.